It's not you, Kelly. No one was talking.
Oh,
No,
okay. Hi, everybody. Okay, I wasn't sure because it looked like you were recording. So,
no.
okay.
I don't think we are. Oh, now we are. Oh my God. Well, I better start then. Oh, bloody hell. The live stream is on. Hello, everyone. Um, gee, Christ. Hey there. Hi there. Ho there. Welcome to this and that. Can we get through with this and move on to writing at 7? I think we have a funny stuff happening later on this evening. A variety of other things. Busy day today. The New York Times endorsed Kamala for president. That was good. Um, those of you who haven't seen the Saturday Night Live cold open, I think Maya Rudolph does probably a nearly perfect impression of Kamala's voice. I really quite uncanny, actually. Um, and other stuff. Not that Saturday Night Live was that good, but it was. I mean, I only watched the cold open and the weekend update. But anyway, on to real stuff. Well, apparently we're halfway through the Hudson book, but Hudson's going to show up on the 10th. So I'm not quite sure if I were reading one chapter a day that we would get there. Um, there being 29 damn chapters in Hudson. So what I'll probably do is read ahead and then do synopses of the subsequent chapters. I'll do part of 16 today, I guess. But note that there are 29 damn chapters. They're not that long. They're about 10 pages apiece. But we want to try and get there. So at least if some people want to go to the class unity thing, they actually uh well, anyway. So that's kind of the deal. And I came across this thing. I just came across it. The Ria Francos teaches at I think Providence College in Rhode Island. And apparently she's teaching a some graduate course for the University of Vienna. And I don't know whether it's on site or whether it's by whatever, uh, by distance learning or something. But it's an interesting little syllabus, and I thought I would go through this partially today, just to suggest to you that um, it's a wide variety of disciplines at work. I think Theo Francos is a political scientist. I think that's her discipline, um, as I recall. But she's teaching this course on multi-sited fieldwork and planetary processes in an era of geoeconomics. So that's another one of these highfalutin. I am always impressed by other people's ability to make these titles. Probably the only thing I can actually call a skill. Anyway, let me read it quickly. Across the social sciences, there's a growing interest in processes that are transnational, even global in scope, climate crisis, energy transition, cross-border migration, great power conflict, and more. But such processes pose a challenge to empirical research. How can we rigorously study processes that are unfolding in real time, uncertain in their outcomes, and multi-sited and multi-scalar in their geography? So that's a lot of stuff. This course would tackle this methodological challenge and takes us one point of departure. My publication of cases to sites studying global processes in comparative politics, which charts out an approach to studying global processes versus multi-sited research designs, wherein global process and local sites are grasped as co-constitutive scales. Already a little out there, deep. The course also has a substantive focus, the energy transition and green industrial policy as both a domestic and a global interstate phenomenon in an era defined by intensifying geopolitical tensions, accelerating climate crisis, and deepening inequalities. That pretty much covers the gamut. Throughout the course, we will explore the intersection of the energy transition with systemic developments in global capitalism via debates over contested concepts such as political capitalism, secular stagnation, neo-mercantilism, and green extractivism. So you name it, it's got it. And I'm putting this up here. I mean, obviously she's starting the course, and who knows whether she's going to make any of this available. But I thought the reading list was just interesting in and of itself. Apparently, she's doing there is a subfield called comparative politics, which usually compares different political systems. Prof. John can probably address that better than I can. John Agnew, for example, is a geographer. Actually, I think an economic geographer, well, he does politics as well. Has done some of the most interesting work out there. I think it's John Agnew who does the things on the local state. But anyway, the territorial trap, geographical assumptions of international relations theory. Now that's tackling a very large topic. Marion Werner's Geographies of Production, 1 and 2. And that's in human geography, which is a subfield of geography, of course. There's a variety of other geographies out there, physical geography, political geography at all. Ellen Bentley and Jonas Nam's Strategies of Green Industrial Policy, Nem Singh's Advance of the State and the Renewal of Industrial Policy, Jack Copley's Decarbonizing the Downturn, Green Microfinancial Regimes. That's kind of an interesting idea there. And Rio Francos is doing lithium onshoring in the global north. That's probably a very interesting article, and only from last year. And so other things, rethinking energy geopolitics, some general stuff, but it's more specific as you get further down here. And there's some interesting ideas. There's more stuff to read, unfortunately, right? Martin Arboleta's Planetary Mind, Territories of Extraction Under Late Capitalism. That sounds pretty deep there. Rare Earth Frontiers. The whole thing of it's my own side interest, of course, is on that questions of mining, etc. I did a thing on coal yesterday over in the coast in the anti-capitalist page. I was just celebrating the end of, or Britain is celebrating the end of coal extraction, coal energy production in the UK has ended after 200 some odd years. And so that's interesting. On the one hand, that's not where all the coal production is occurring. So while as important as it was for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and Britain's hegemony over the colonial and imperial hegemony, it's not as important as China's or Indonesia's even. And there's a thing here on Brett Christophers, has done this stuff on fictitious capital, fossilized capital, price and profit in the energy transition. So I think Alice Maw's Future-Proofing Capitalism, the Paradox of the Circular Economy for Plastic. That's probably very interesting as well. With something on lithium ions stuff, steel decarbonization, which also very interesting, probably a very interesting piece. So all very new articles. So this is kind of cutting edge stuff. And so probably as we proceed through Xmas, I will probably try and track down a couple of these articles, make them available in the Discord, maybe report on them, a couple of them, or summarize them quickly. So And I'm hoping that, Rio Francos is doing a kind of a course with sessions that might be available uh, online, and maybe, or if you feel compelled, you might just send her a note, considering how open her stuff is here. And anyway, so I thought I'd point that out. Note that there, as I said, there's unfortunately far too many chapters still left to do in the Michael Hudson book. And so without further ado, let me start on 16, I think. Hold on. Give me a second here. Now, what I'm going to do today is read a little bit of 16, but in future, I'm going to finish the reading myself and then summarize probably each chapter and get us to the end of it in a couple of days, I hope. Yes, it's a lot to read and a lot to remember, and there's technical stuff in here, but collateralized debt obligations and a variety of other crazy things that you probably won't remember, but the 2008 crisis does have a lot of institutions in it. Those who went to the class unity session on Sunday will note that that I was being put upon to participate. I didn't want to get into a hairy thing because it is a kind of hairy thing to talk about this stuff. Bailing out of Goldman via AIG, quote from Chuck Grassley, Iowa senator. It's as if the New York Fed used AIG as a front man to bail out big banks all over the world. Gee, you think? Much of the real motivation for seizing AIG was dragged out of witnesses in the lawsuit brought by Maurice Greenberg, whose Star International was AIG's biggest shareholder. When the 6-week trial finally began in September 2014, former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson acknowledged that popular anger at Wall Street's investment banks had made Congress unwilling to appropriate more than the $700 billion in TARP funding. The money to cover investment bank losses would be found somewhere. Next to Citigroup, Goldman seems to have been the most overstretched, but it managed to take charge of the bailout on all government levels. Former CEO Hank Paulson at Treasury said that he stood largely aside, but former Goldman CEO Stephen Friedman had become chairman of the New York Fed. Most directly, Paulson appointed Goldman board member Edward Liddy as AIG CEO. Liddy had been a member of the board of Goldman Sachs since 2003 and head of its audit committee since 2007. He held a considerable amount of Goldman stock when the bailout took place, a conflict of interest blunting AIG's ability to resist Goldman's demands. Pressed by Goldman officers to accept the position, Liddy was appointed AIG's chief executive on September 18th, but he remained a Goldman director until September 23rd, and he testified that he attended a Goldman board meeting by telephone 2 days earlier on September 21st. Later that evening, Mr. Liddy led an AIG board meeting where he urged the insurer's directors to accept the government's costly bailout, costly to AIG, that is. It proved to be a bonanza for Goldman. Goldman said, in effect, we need this much in S. Geithner at the New York Fed to make AIG pay it, and also to pay Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, Citigroup et al. This prompted Representative Stephen F. Lynch, a Democrat from Massachusetts, to respond to Treasury Secretary Geithner at a congressional committee hearing on January 26, 2010. I think the commitment to Goldman Sachs trumped the responsibility that our officials had to the American people. One reporter found only 2 possible explanations for the overly solicitous treatment of Goldman and the others. The first is that their own financial position was so precarious that accepting anything else, anything less than the billions that they expected from AIG would have destabilized them too, which is to say, it really was a backdoor bailout of the banks, many of which, like Goldman, claimed they didn't need one. Alternatively, maybe Mr. Geithner simply felt that Goldman and the like had a more legitimate claim to billions of dollars in funds than the taxpayers who were footing the bill. That's generally how it always is. The asymmetry, the next section, asymmetry in how AIG was treated compared to Goldman Citigroup at all. In contrast to TARP and special loans made to Citigroup, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Merrill Lynch at concessionary interest rates, the government charged AIG a high rate. Thomas C. Baxter Jr., the New York Fed's general counsel, described the 14% rate and 8.5% on the credit line that AIG did not draw down as loan sharky. And yes, loan sharking, the difference between one legal and illegal, it seems quite baffling. The problem was not merely the high interest rate the government charged AIG for loans it was forced to spend on paying Goldman and other counterparties. AIG had good reasons not to pay anywhere near what Goldman demanded, and even to contest payment on the grounds that Goldman misrepresented the junk mortgages it insured and then bet against. Early that year, other insurance companies had started to negotiate CDO write-downs with their counterparties. CDO is a collateralized debt obligation. By the start of 2008, it was clear the insurance companies were running out of funds, so MBIA, AMBAC, and others then did what cash-strapped companies normally do. They settled with bondholders at a discount between 10 and 60% of face value. But in contrast to the write-downs that other insurance firms obtained from their counterparties, the former Goldman officials in charge of AIG did not let it impose haircuts on its derivative contracts with Goldman or other counterparties. Instead of bargaining with Wall Street bank over valuations of their security, the Fed blocked AIG from doing so by taking 79.8% of its stock. This was the only financial institution over which the government took actual control. Its preferred stockholdings in Citigroup did not involve voting rights and hence did not enable it to interfere with policy. But the Fed's takeover of AIG was done on terms that committed the company not to question any payments made, not to contest the demands of Goldman or other counterparties to write down what it already had to pay them, and not to file for bankruptcy. AIG was still solvent and current on its payments at the time of its takeover. Looking back at the fact that most junk mortgages were still being paid at a higher rate than pessimists had thought, New York Times journalist Gretchen Morgenson asked, well, why would those companies agree to pay out in full to a policyholder even if a fire had not occurred? Reviewing the details of the double standard imposed on AIG, Morgenson later suggested that perhaps the government saw an opportunity in the insurer's liquidity crisis. It could become an enormous taxpayer-funded piggy bank from which the government could funnel billions to a throng of teetering banks. Remember, taxpayers were growing increasingly outraged by bank rescues in fall 2008. The alternative was write-downs and lengthy court proceedings. A bankruptcy judge could invalidate as avoidable preference the transfer of collateral money from AIG to Goldman if the transfer took place within 90 days of the filing of the bankruptcy petition. Now, the last thing Wall Street firms wanted was to drive AIG bankrupt. A financial corpse would yield up much less than 100 cents on the dollar. The banks wanted to be paid in full without the delay that bankruptcy proceedings entail. Chapter 11 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code includes a crammed-down provision that allows the courts to confirm a bankruptcy plan over the objection of some creditors, preventing a few recalcitrant parties from holding up the settlement. The mere threat of bankruptcy thus gives distressed debtors enormous leverage. This is a transaction cost problem. Even first-year law students in Contracts 101 learned that there are numerous exceptions to the sanctity of contracts. One pension fund advisor noted, contracts are legally abrogated every day. A big part of our court system is given over to litigating disputes over the enforceability of various commercial contract provisions. But instead of using this threat of bankruptcy when the government interceded on behalf of Goldman and other counterparties, Tim Geithner, Obama economic advisor, Austin Goolsbee, He teaches at Chicago, at University of Chicago. And Larry Summers lamely expressed fake anger to the media about how much they hated to bail out AIG, but felt obliged to defend the banks on the grounds of the pretended sanctity of contracts. The threat of deferring payment for years as tedious lawsuits ran their course could have saved AIG as much as half the ultimate $182 billion it was stuck with. This prospect would have encouraged its counterparties to acquiesce quickly for smaller payment, as typically is done in such cases. By contrast, the Congressional Oversight Panel points out the government chose not to exploit its negotiating leverage with respect to the counterparties. Once the government made clear that it was committed to the wholesale rescue of AIG, it lost the significant leverage it might have had over the thousands of AIG creditors. Indeed, the panel concluded, even after the Federal Reserve and Treasury decided that a public rescue was the only choice, they still could have pursued options other than paying every creditor and every counterparty at 100 cents on the dollar. Arrangements in which different creditors accept different degrees of loss are common in bankruptcy proceedings or other negotiations when a distressed company is involved. And in this case, the government failed to use its significant negotiating leverage to extract such compromises. To have allowed AIG to act in its own interest would have brought down the edifice of fictitious financial capital valuations, revealing the junk mortgage fraud. So AIG had to be stopped from defending itself and settling a legal precedent for writing down junk mortgage derivatives vis-a-vis Wall Street's financial behemoths. At one point in the trial, Greenberg's lawyer, Mr. Boies, the same Boies of the David Boies of the Bush-Gore fiasco of the 2000 election, zeroed in on the idea of whether some banks that were insolvent were given more lenient loan terms than AIG. The plaintiffs argued that AIG at the time was solvent but suffering from a liquidity crisis. The government disagrees. Using one of Mr. Geithner's unpublished book interviews, he raised the subject of Citigroup and Bank of America, two banks that received bailouts in the crisis. Certainly, Citi and B of A were insolvent, Mr. Geithner had said during the book interview. The two men then engaged in a lengthy back and forth over the definition of insolvent. In the ordinary course of business, the well-established rules of bankruptcy would have led AIG's counterparties to write down their claims. Instead, rescuing AIG transformed Wall Street's risky derivative wagers into government-guaranteed obligations. It was as if the high-risk trade and default insurance derivatives deserved the same backstop as FDIC-insured savings deposits and checking accounts. The scare tactic was that the alternative was chaos. On the systemic level, this meant simply that some gamblers could not collect from what had been organized as a rigged game. Geithner explained to President Obama that chaos meant asking Goldman and other banks to take haircuts on the killings they had made, and even further, not paying Wall Street speculators their expected bonuses and salaries in full. Yeah, thanks, Obama. Next section, covert maneuvering and influence peddling by Wall Street over the Fed and Treasury. When pressed by Congress and the financial media, the Federal Reserve and Treasury resisted identifying the recipients of the bailout money for months, citing confidentiality agreements. The panel notes that Goldman has declined to supply the panel with the identities of its own counterparties or any documentation with respect to those relationships or its own hedges on AIG. The fact that Goldman and the Fed fought so hard to keep matters secret suggests that they knew quite well that Goldman was not being honest in claiming that it had fully hedged its AIG exposure and thus would be unaffected by AIG bankruptcy. However, Bloomberg finally extracted the details of the deal by filing a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request. The documents it obtained revealed that the banks had bought the swaps from that the banks that bought the swaps from AIG are mostly the same firms that underwrote the collateralized debt obligation to CDOs in the first place. In some cases, banks also owned mortgage lenders, and they should be challenged to explain whether they gained any insider knowledge about the quality of the loans bundled into the CDOs. As one observer put matters, this is tantamount to building a house, planting a bomb in it, selling it to an unsuspecting buyer, and then buying $20 billion worth of life insurance on the homeowner, who you know is going to die. I think that's a good way to put it. To get paid quickly on its own terms, Goldman went to Tim Geithner, president of the New York Fed, nicknamed the bailouter-in-chief by Sheila Bair. Geithner selected Morgan Stanley as the legal advisor to the New York Fed to come up with a solution that would, quote unquote, restore normalcy. That is, save Goldman from loss, just as the TARP bailout was saving Citigroup. So this is all rigging. The way in which the Fed intervened in the AIG Goldman squabble stood in sharp contrast to how it had strong-armed Wall Street banks to bail out long-term credit management in 1998. This was the principle of shared sacrifice that J.P. Morgan had organized in the wake of the 1907 crash. What a guy, J.P. But the Congressional Oversight Panel pointed out that a decade of political maneuvering since 1998 had enabled Wall Street to commandeer the reins of U.S. regulatory agencies, the Federal Reserve and Treasury, which compelled the government to pay when the 2008 bubble burst. By providing a complete bailout that called for no shared sacrifice among AIG and its creditors, the Congressional Oversight Panel concluded FRBNY, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and Treasury fundamentally changed the rules of America's financial marketplace with regard to how the world's largest banks, government policy, and whether or how economies cope with their bad debt overhead. By bailing out AIG and its counterparties, the federal government signaled that the entire derivatives market, which had been explicitly and completely deregulated by Congress through the CFMA, the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, would now benefit from the same government safety net provided to fully regulated financial products. In essence, the government distorted the marketplace by transforming highly risky derivative bets into fully guaranteed transactions with the American taxpayer standing as guarantor. Still, the panel pointed out, until the afternoon of February 16, 2008, it was at least possible for the government to suggest that it would let AIG fail as a means to demand concessions from AIG's counterparties. This would have been a credible threat, given that the government had just let Lehman fail. Instead, Geithner was able to intervene thanks to a little-known clause in the Federal Reserve Act, giving it authority to exercise, quote, incidental powers as shall be necessary to carry on the business of banking within the limitations prescribed by this act, unquote. As CDS spreads on AIG widened in November, the New York Fed set up a special set of funds called Maiden Lane. It's a street near the Fed, the New York Fed, to buy the mortgage-backed securities held by AIG's counterparties at 100 cents on the dollar, effectively canceling out the CDS, the swaps contracts. This was miles above what those assets could have fetched in the market at the time if they could have been sold at all. This purchase paid off the gamblers and stopped further AIG liability. Soon, the price of these securities recovered so that AIG would not have ended up having to pay anywhere near as much to the counterparties as the Fed paid. Next section, Geithner's web of deception. Geithner claimed that as head of the New York Fed through 2008, he had no choice except to pay AIG's counterparties in full because one bank was French. Hence, he pretended he had to grant the U.S. banks all their winnings on the toxic waste bets they had insured with AIG. His excuse was that French law did not permit write-downs for its banks. Indeed, he said it would be downright criminal for a French bank to do what, in reality, banks all over the world have been doing for many decades. That is, taking a haircut on what they are owed. This is what the Brady Bond write-downs of Latin American debts were all about in the 1980s. It is what Donald Trump has demanded of his banks often enough, and what companies under pressure normally do. The reason for Geithner's French charade became apparent when it turned out that a chunk of the $11 billion paid to the Société Générale was subsequently transferred to Goldman under a deal the two banks had struck. When Goldman had packaged the junk mortgages selected by John Paulson, paying Société Générale was really a way to pay Goldman. The press was full of reports on how unyielding the French were on insisting no write-down, until Sigtarp, that is Neil Borofsky, issued his report, the Inspector General, describing how outrageous was the claim that U.S. law did not permit discrimination among claimants. Geithner's position was that if the Federal Reserve had to pay the French bank Société Générale in full, it would have to pay Goldman Sachs and other U.S. financial casinos in full. But Geithner pretended that his Federal Reserve Bank of New York had no choice but to avoid paying any bank less than 100%, because its own rules prevented it from discriminating and paying the French more than Goldman. All this soon was shown to be a lie, denied by the French. Borofsky accused Geithner of telling the public that the French government had forcibly rejected any concessions from its banks. To find out for himself, he reports, I arranged for a Saturday afternoon call with the French regulator. She emphasized that she had not slammed the door on negotiations and had been more than ready to engage with them in the Fed, so long as they were at a high level and universal. But she told us the Fed officials had never seriously pursued that option, commenting that she had been surprised when the Fed officials had never called back. When I asked her about the Fed's assertion that it would have been illegal under French law to agree to such a discount, she said that the French government could have waived that restriction, but with no negotiations, no waiver. News leaked out that that UBS, that is the Union Bank of Switzerland, had quickly agreed to a 2% haircut, which would have amounted to $280 million for starters. Geithner failed to report this offer, presumably telling UBS to sit tight while he insisted that the Treasury pay all the banks in full. His subordinate, the New York Fed General Counsel, Thomas Baxter, confirmed that the Fed staff had consulted with Geithner about UBS's offer, and instead of telling them to negotiate further, Geithner had given the offer to effectively pay the bank full price for the bonds. We were stunned. Rather than pounce on UBS's apparent willingness to negotiate and use that as leverage with the others, he had just simply folded the tent. Despite all the stonewalling he received about this, Borofsky writes that Geithner, who by this time had moved up to Treasury, and this is this whole kind of, musical chair shit, served Goldman and other banks by undercutting any chance of getting relief for the taxpayer by deciding that no once concession would be accepted unless all of the banks agreed to the exact same percentage reduction. Geithner emerged from this episode as something of a partner in crime for giving in so quickly when Goldman and other banksters reached the moon. I've always wondered why none of AIG's counterparties didn't have to take any haircuts, remarked Sheila Bair upon leaving the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. There's no reason in the world why those swap counterparties couldn't have taken a 10% haircut. There could have been at least a little pain for them. They didn't even engage in conversation about that. Wall Street barely missed a beat with their bonuses. The next section, the bonus kerfuffle distracts attention from where the bailout money went. It is an indication of the extent to which the banking system and high finance had degenerated into grabbitization that Geithner whined that it would signal the end of capitalism not to keep paying bonuses and salaries to the bankers whose behavior had caused the crash. In his 2015 memoir, Believer, My 40 Years in Politics, President Obama's campaign advisor, David Axelrod, reports that he was livid when he found that Geithner and Summers had quietly lobbied against an amendment to the stimulus that would have restricted the payment of bonuses at firms that received bailout funds. Those bonuses have become a huge political sore point for the administration, but the finance guys argued that retroactive steps to claw back the money would have violated existing contracts. This would have been the end of capitalism as we know it, Geithner told Axelrod. Law professor Bill Black explains how this one-sided idea of breaking contracts favored Wall Street against the economy and its long-term viability. Preventing banks that receive bailouts from paying future bonuses is not clawing back bonuses. Clawing back bonuses means recovering bonuses that were improperly paid based on false accounting statements that massively overstated bank income. Neither of the practices I have described would have violated existing contracts. Even before Axelrod's revelation, the matter had come to a head regarding AIG's bonuses to the company's financial records. On March 17th, 2009, precisely half a year after the bailout, AIG announced that it would pay $165 million in retention awards, its euphemism for bonuses, to 400 employees at its London office. See, actually, I think that was the whole deal, is that it's this London office that where all the leverage is coming out of. But anyway, total bonuses were said to possibly reach $450 million for the financial unit and $1.2 billion for the entire company over the next 2 years. Although the $165 million in bonuses amounted to only 0.1% of AIG's $182 billion bailout, it afforded an opportunity to distract attention from the much larger giveaways to Wall Street bankers. Having voted for the AIG bailout as a senator, President Obama now tried to publicly distance himself. Quote, "I asked Secretary Geithner to use that leverage and pursue every legal avenue to block these bonuses and make the American taxpayers whole." Larry Summers chimed in, quote, "There are a lot of terrible things that have happened in the last 18 months, but what's happened at AIG is the most outrageous." Well, as the Wall Street Journal editorialized over these crocodile tears, well, the Washington crowd wants to focus on bonuses because it aims public anger on private actors, not the political class. Since September 16th, AIG has sent $120 billion in cash collateral and other payouts to banks, municipal governments, and other derivative counterparties around the world. It's not capitalism in which risk takers suffer the consequences of bad decisions. Unquote. Only the top-ranking too-big-to-fail banks were saved from the debt leveraging that plagued the rest of the economy. AIG's counterparties were liberated from losses, but homeowners suffered defaults, while cities and states faced abandonments and plunging tax revenues. Employees lost their jobs, as I raised my hand. Normal investors lost, and taxpayers were stuck with the obligation to pay the Wall Street giants. President Obama capped the hypocrisy by asking Treasury Secretary Geithner to prepare an accounting charade to give the impression that the government actually made money on the deal. This contrived exercise served to distract attention from the fact that the Federal Reserve's maiden lane entity had paid 100% of the face value of the CDOs, the collateralized debt obligations that were selling on the open market, only half the price. Geithner's public relations calculation did not take into account such overpayments, tax giveaways, subsidies, and below normal interest rates that financial analysts normally use to evaluate gains and losses. These multiple forms of giveaway broke more than a century's tradition for how governments are supposed to handle crises, prompting the Congressional Oversight Panel to conclude, quote, "The government's actions in rescuing AIG continue to have a poisonous effect on the marketplace," unquote. They reflected how the financial marketplace, that is Wall Street, had captured government regulatory agencies, disabled congressional oversight, and neutered the law courts in order to make sure that no bank manager or CEO involved in the financial crisis would ever be jailed, fired, or even have his or her salary and bonuses clawed back. Geithner will appear repeatedly in the next few chapters, flying to Europe as well as around the United States to make sure that his Wall Street constituency would be paid at the economy's expense. Reviewing how his memoir, Stress Test, sought to whitewash his behavior by depicting himself as, quote, "a firefighter constantly on call to extinguish a fresh blaze." Financial Times columnist John Kay found, quote, many things wrong with this analogy. The stuff Geithner used to douse the fires is not cold water, but a stream of liberal credit, precisely what set the blaze alight in the first place. Better, perhaps, to limit access to matches and petrol and to construct fire breaks. Perhaps the problem is one for the police as well as the fire service. Handcuffs might be as useful as the fire hose, unquote. Now, the obvious question that government regulators sought to prevent the public from asking was, why not nationalize these reckless banks whose entire net worth was less than the government's $25 billion TARP loan? Citibank and Bank of America, and very nearly Goldman and other investment banks, were insolvent without the government giveaways. Taking over ownership and operating them as a public financial option would have enabled the government to fire the officers responsible for the bad and often crooked loans and recoup what they had paid themselves in salaries and bonuses on the deception that their management was making money, not losing it. After all, bank managers of such institutions did not provide productive management, but just the opposite. They acted in a predatory way that poisoned the financial system with toxic waste. The government's failure to take ownership gave managers, stockholders, and bondholders a free lunch. Why did the government only move against AIG? And even then, not to stop rewarding its London financial managers, but to pay those of Goldman and other Wall Street institutions to preserve and subsidize the behavior that had caused the crisis. A New York Times editorial summed up the inequity at work regarding the corruption and insider dealing that emerged from Greenberg's lawsuit over the seizure of AIG to pay better connected bankers. Quote, now, this is the editorial. Mr. Greenberg rests his claim partly on the fact that the government imposed tougher terms on AIG than on bailout banks. The government, for example, took a controlling equity stake in AIG, largely wiping out shareholders. In contrast, it left shareholders at bailed out banks intact, even at arguably insolvent institutions like Bank of America and Citigroup. The injustice in that disparate treatment, however, is not that AIG was treated too harshly, but that the banks got off too easy. If the government had taken control of, let's say, Bank of America, taxpayers would have shared directly in its recovery. Instead, the subsequent gains flowed to shareholders who, but for the bailouts, would have been ruined. The government also took control over how the AIG bailout money was spent. The bank bailouts, in contrast, had no strings attached, virtually no strings attached. That harmed the public because there was no way for the government to force the banks to increase lending and help those homeowners, even though officials had said that the bailouts would foster lending and foreclosure relief. Last paragraph. It's certainly true that the government deserves criticism for how it spent the AIG bailout money. It funneled the money to the banks to make them whole on deals they had done with AIG, instead of requiring them to absorb some of the losses. But again, the real victim of the overly generous treatment of the banks is the American public. That's the end of that, and we're almost at the end. Fortunes were made by betting on the inability of debtors to pay and being able to collect via government bailouts to favored insiders. This money could have been created just as readily to save homeowners from default. But it was given to the banks while letting them foreclose on mortgages gone bad at the very outset. The economy has not recovered except for the economy of the 1%. The next few chapters will trace how this bad debt dynamic is unfolding from the United States to the Eurozone. So that's the end of chapter 16. I'll stop right now if there are comments, questions. As I said, what I'm probably going to do is read ahead, cut down my yammering here and summarize these so we can get expeditiously before the 6th of October when Lapavitas, whatever, one of the guy who wrote that other article, and a really good article actually, and Michael Hudson come talk to the Class Unity folks, which I think will be very useful, just simply to hear them talk a little bit about their articles and also updated. Obviously, they'll have more current positions on the whole 2008 deal. So chapters 17 through 29, I'll try and read ahead, summarize them quickly so we can sort of plow through that in the next couple of days. As I said, the other project, I think, which is a useful project, among many other projects, I have plenty of other projects, is to look at that syllabus and get to sort of some of the current discussions on the wider sort of global green issues, and sort of in general. Recognizing, of course, from a Marxist point of view, you want to emphasize that eco-socialism underlies some of the issues, that there are economic questions of whether who's in charge relative to policy, whether it's being manipulated, as you can see, by banksters, among others, other big capitalists, and et al. So that's what I propose to do. I mean, you can read this at your leisure and at your own speed. It's unfortunate there isn't a audio book that we could just simply trundle through, make life easier. So so I'll apologize for that. Let me ask if there are any questions or comments or brickbats, and go to the chat. End of capitalism, hell yes. Yes. Well, Geithner needs to be dragged in front of a more congressional stuff. Yes, then from Eurozone to third world, that's one path, but it's not always from the Eurozone. It's just directly for this. Yes, none of us voted for this. The government decided in its infinite wisdom.
To me, it's like, how can you make a statement like that? The government decided.
Wow, it's just, there are times when there's a crisis, people punt. It's it's sad. And does require us to be much more attentive and considering that with respect, some people who get elected are idiots. It's just, it's surprising we get anything done at all. Well, some of them get saved by staff work. Staff work sometimes fixes that problem. In other cases, it's the civil service, that is, all those people who Trump wants to replace with his own people, actually fix some of these problems. The bureaucracy actually does work. The Administrative Policy Act is actually a good thing relative to the massive bureaucracy that still exists and will exist even after Trump puts his cronies in place. Okay, anyone else? Brickbats, commentaries, interventions? I know it's been very tedious to read through this, and aside from Hudson should have had a better editor and writing a proofreader.
I just found my blood boiling, and just, with every word it got worse, in
retrospect, even as it was happening, you can read between the lines. It's just like Geithner would make a statement and you'd go, well, that doesn't seem right. And people would agitate, but the problem is, like, business journalism tends to not be very critical of these, what you need in the business press are a few socialists to sort of trash some of these things going on. Rather than, if you watch CNBC or Fox Business or whatever, these people are just touts, they're, well, you should buy this or buy that or whatever. And they don't really get in there and say, well, this is where the problem is. I mean, there are a couple of people on there, Sorkin, maybe, there are a couple of people in there who have the right kind of view of capitalism, but the rest are just simply shills to the system.
Well, yeah, and it's like, there's it's democracy is unprepared for this. Democracy can't, sort of
Well,
deal with this, right?
every time democracy stepped in and goes, well, this needs to be sort of coordinated a little better. Somebody will either seize control of, that something will happen, and or else an election year will turn around and all those good things that were created get, shot to hell, which is kind of what happened when Trump took over. It's all kinds of crap happened, or things didn't get acted on, and so you had like this hiatus of, attention to things.
Yeah, right. To regulate, you got to be paying attention, have resources to do that, right?
Well, that's why you have regulatory agencies, and the whole point of the Republicans is that they're constantly trying to, thwart the regulatory agencies, and so every time you get a shift in Congress, you have all these things that, wow, that was a good thing to suggest, but now we're going to kill it and do something else that actually negates it, which is what happens in policy. Of course, they won't admit that it negates it. What they'll say is this improves it by making it more, whatever you want to call it, you fill in the blank, efficient, or, whatever.
Yeah.
Policy people are very cynical about this on the one hand. On the other hand, the policy people are only the people who are actually in the bureaucracy are the only people standing between, the economy and chaos often.
Well, yeah, I mean that's what Geithner was positioning himself as, right?
Yeah. I'm not going to advocate certain matters that in a different world, I think there would be accountability, but everyone gets bought off in one way or the other, which is incredibly sad.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. 165 million is a fraction compared to the billions that were.
Oh yeah, I mean it's chump change. I mean it's just the worst, and we're distracted by other matters. We worry about cats and dogs being eaten and whatever. God, we wasted a whole week on stupid crap.
Well, I guess it's working. It's
Well,
crazy. He's dialing up the crazy.
Capitalism survives only, just dumb luck keeps it going. The advantage, of course, is scale. I mean, if the US were the size of, well, the UK, we'd be in big, big, big trouble. But, we control reserve currency and a lot of levers of power and all kinds of other crap. So, we're sort of surviving, but, in spite of ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay. If there's no other bits of yammering, I will shut down the proverbial live